Story 1, The Bell Witch by a Mile. It's got everything you need: paranormal events, unexplained death, a fucking haunted cave. I know you all will say, but trend rudely, isn't that technically folklore? And didn't this happen out in the middle of fuck all nowhere a hella wicked long time ago? 1800s son, and you can still go check out the creepy ass cave. Plus, and this is the damn maraschino on the Manhattan, it's the only time in modern history that a ghost has been cited as an official cause of death. I'll tell you the story as it was told to me. John Bell was a farmer who lived on a modest 2-story homestead in Adams, TN, with his wife and children. One afternoon, walking the perimeter of his land with a varmint rifle, he spotted a creature in his cornfield. Some hellish chimeric beast with the body of a dog, the head of a rabbit, and the face of a man. He fired several times, but it evaded him and escaped into the woods. From that point on, the Bells knew no peace. Their dinners would be halted by incessant battering on the walls of their home. John and his eldest son would leave to investigate and find nothing. The children complained of nightmares, sounds in the floorboards and then at the foot of their beds. Then their covers would disappear in the night and be found in the fields outside, or stuffed into cupboards or closets too high for them to reach. Soon the whispers began, the voice of a woman calling out the family by name, beckoning them to the cave just behind the wood line of the forested corner of the Bell estate. None dared go. Who would sing to the Bell children ghastly atonal renditions of hymns, mock and threaten the life of John, and single out his daughter, Betsy Bell, for the most virulent of first verbal, then physical torment? Betsy would awaken with fingernail-like scratches on her body, as if she'd been clawed at in the night. Over time, the whispers grew to accusatory shouts, then screams. As the events continued, John Bell's physical health declined. The color drained from his face and hair. He took ill for months at a time, never fully recovering. He would complain of a weight on his chest, labored breathing, and always the whispering voice of the witch was with him. It lasted 3 years. In his final days, he was bedridden, gripped by an unquenchable fever. Surrounded by his grieving family, he passed painfully from this world, and no sooner than his dying breath had left him, the room erupted with the cold, sourceless laughter of the Bell Witch, who, after that day, was never heard again. Story 2. A few years ago, a mother and father decided they needed a break, so they wanted to head out for a night on the town. They called their most trusted babysitter. When the babysitter arrived, the 2 children were already fast asleep in bed. So the babysitter just got to sit around and make sure everything was okay with the children. Later that night, the babysitter got bored and went to watch TV. But she couldn't watch it downstairs because they did not have cable downstairs. The parents didn't want children watching too much garbage. So she called them and asked them if she could watch cable in the parents' room. Of course, the parents said it was okay, but the babysitter had one final request. She asked if she could cover up the David Bowie statue outside the bedroom window with a blanket or cloth, at the very least close the blinds because it made her nervous. The phone line was silent for a moment, and the father, who was talking to the babysitter at the time, said, "Take the children and get out of the house. We will call the police. We do not have a David Bowie statue." All of a sudden, an electric guitar cut through the air. "Keep your electric eyes on me, babe," howled a voice from outside. The babysitter dropped the phone and ran to the window. "David fucking Bowie," she screamed, watching the statue as it came to life, shredding chords on its electric guitar. "Put your ray gun to my head." The babysitter ran the children outside, where they watched an impromptu Bowie concert that was so awesome that afterward the children had sweet dreams forevermore, and the babysitter was given a bonus for her efforts. Story 3. There are many in Hawaii based on modern and ancient folklore. Menehune is mentioned here in the comments somewhere. Another is of aumakua, or spiritual family guardians that take the shape of a specific native animal, not all in that species, but a specific animal or two: owl, turtle, shark, etc. My old Hawaiian studies professor gave an account of a past student who would come to class covered in bruises. This particular student lived on an old property he inherited from his grandparents after both had passed. He had no idea where the bruises came from, but would find fresh bruises every morning. He woke up. He was instructed by my professor to look for any puka or hole on the property. He found a puka as deep as a well and could hear a faint sound of water below. Turns out that the puka led to an ancient volcanic tube that opened up to the ocean. He shared his discovery with my professor, who then instructed him to toss fish down the puka. The kid did as directed, and the bruises stopped from then on. It is said that his family's aumakua, a shark, had occupied that volcanic tube, and it is each family's responsibility to take care of their particular aumakua, else there be consequences. Knowledge of aumakua is kept secret for protection from those who would mean to do it harm. It's likely that this guy's grandparents had been feeding this shark up until their passing and did not pass that knowledge on to their grandson. The native Hawaiian concept of responsibility is that you have that responsibility, whether you are aware of it or not. Ignorance does not get a pass, as is the case for this guy getting bruised for not fulfilling his responsibility of caring for his aumakua. This might be a bit superstitious, but here are a few things that could be more relevant to anyone thinking of visiting Hawaii and might doing some hiking. Always hike with a partner. However, if you still decide to hike alone or get separated from your group, do not answer to anyone whose voice you don't recognize. If you hear a voice trying to lead you, do not follow it. It is believed that mischievous spirits occupy the forest and may lead you off a cliff. If you're hiking in a valley and happen upon a large body of water, toss a leaf in. If it floats, then it's okay to swim. If it doesn't, then the mo'o serpent lizard that resides in the water is present and does not wish for you to enter. Another sign that a mo'o might be present is the lack of vegetation on the perimeter of the water. Story 4. La Llorona, the weeping woman who walks the acequias and creeks of northern New Mexico looking for little children to snatch up. The story goes she fell in love with a man, and when she found out he didn't want any children of his own, she drowned her own in the river. Horrified by her actions, the man moved on, abandoning her completely, so she then gave her own life to the river. From that day on, dressed in white, her ghost travels up and down the waterways, constantly weeping, looking for her children. When I was a child, my mother and I both heard her down by the acequia ditch. It was nighttime. I was coloring when the wails chillingly echoed through our thin trailer walls. We looked at each other without saying a word, then just went back to what we were doing. When we heard it the second time, we jumped up with our eyes as big as silver dollars and phoned our vaquero neighbors, who came looking with their big trucks and spotlights. It could have been a mountain lion, they said, or, of course, La Llorona. I froze. My days of playing at the ditch were over. I slept in the closet with my cat and her new kittens that night. To this day, my mom and I both agree what we heard was otherworldly. Story 5. This is less urban and more rural. The Wild Man of Deerfield, a small, sleepy town where locals continue to tell the below in varying ways. I can assure you this is the most faithful telling. I'm from a part of the United States where the sky is scarce and the trees are thick, and they talk about you as though you aren't even there. A few years ago, in a place called Deerfield, a body was found inside a half-buried large blue rubber barrel filled with acid by a couple of local kids playing in the woods. The area used to be a general store, but all that remained after it was condemned and torn down was a rock wall around the property in a semi-cleared rectangle. It was spotted with underbrush and saplings, located where two dirt roads met but people didn't. The bodies were two adults, one female and one male, and one female fetus was found outside of the womb, but still attached to her mother in the barrel. The body of the male was found first by the kids, who called the cops. The cops popped open another barrel found, half exposed, which spilled the woman and child. When the cops made the obvious connection to foul play and swept the area, they found 6 more barrels buried around the property, each filled with a different body, some female, some male, with no discernible pattern in age. Though the most recently dead body died about 8 years ago, all were white. But the area this happened in is nearly 98% white. Many of the bodies seem to match missing person reports made in Deerfield around the time they died. The acid eroded most of many identifying physical features, but being sort of watered down and improperly applied, the police were able to find some of the families of the missing and now confirmed dead people. Last I checked, 3 of the bodies remain unidentified. The only lead is that the barrels were stolen 30 years ago from the State Department of Transportation. My father, dating my mother at the time, was driving home one night. It was late, Being a mischievous young man spending personal time with a young woman, he was on cloud nine, elated by the love and its secretive nature. His custom Mustang bounced along the long dirt road. The drive was lonely but well lit by a full moon shining silver on the empty clearing to his left, not penetrating the stoic tree line. It was a quiet evening he looked forward to repeating many times, when suddenly large movement to the right side of the road wildly exited the tree line, flailing. What were now arms in my father's headlights and screaming, coming from a wild shock of hair and a dirty face and wide red-rimmed eyes. My father slammed on the brakes and swerved to narrowly avoid the man, who he could now see was shirtless, covered in grass stains, dirt and broken foliage. The man had dove to avoid the car, righted himself using the rear of the vehicle, and made his way to the front of it, clambering across it the whole way. There was something wrong with his leg. He screamed and hollered for help. His leg was broken, and he needs a doctor. Oh, please help him. It was before cell phones. My father was scared. Having heard before that robbers use this technique to gain access to their victims' cars, he locked his doors and told the man through rolled-up windows to remain there, that he would get help. The man immediately stopped pleading and went livid, beating on the windows of the car, screaming louder and incomprehensibly. My frightened father stepped on the gas, looking back once to see a man running full tilt in the full moon's light. There was no limp, no lurching, 2 working legs. He turned a corner where 2 roads met with a clearing ahead of them and hauled ass back home. He sat in his car for a good 10 minutes before exiting it, wondering if what had just transpired was real, until he went to open his car door and saw it was cracked, littered with flecks of spittle with dust stuck within it. He called the Deerfield police the next morning. He drove to their station, well within the morning hours, to report what he saw. He led the police to the road he was on, but they didn't find anything on the road by the clearing where the 2 roads met. Not for another 30 years. To this day, we wonder if the man my father almost ran over was a victim or the killer himself. Story 6. This is a scary story I was told while at a Christian summer camp. I haven't been to that camp in a couple of years, so the story is a bit fuzzy. Bear with me. So, this really old lady, her name was Ezra or Edna, lived in this house in the middle of a field. She had 1 blue eye and 1 red eye. This farmer, John Ironworks, I think, really wanted to buy her house so he could increase the size of his farm. Every day he would increase the offering price, but she would refuse every time. He got so fed up he killed her, cut out her blue eye, rode out to the middle of the lake. The lake was like 150 away from her house, and dumped her body. So several years later, the farmer had moved his house to where her house used to be. One day he noticed that his most prized cow had basically exploded. Parts of the cow were everywhere. John was angry, but there really was nothing he could do. The next day, his second most prized cow has done the same thing. Parts of the cow are everywhere. So that night he waits up with his shotgun. Late into the night he sees bubbles coming from the lake, and slowly out comes a really old lady with 1 red eye. She walks up to a cow, touches it, and it explodes. He opens fire, but it does nothing. He hops in his truck and speeds away. He sold the land without ever returning, and the new owner found the family of John was killed, and pieces of human were scattered everywhere around the house. Years later, a Jewish camp, still have no idea why that's relevant, bought the property. And 3 kids decided to go skinny dipping late at night. They sneak out ahead to the lake. One of the kids chickens out and runs back to the cabin. The other 2 continue on. When they arrive at the lake, one kid runs straight in while the other stays a bit back, afraid he is going to get in trouble. Then the bubbles start. The kids are really confused about what is happening. The kid in the water just explodes, and the kids on the beach sprint back to the cabin. A bit later, the lad and her red eye arrive at the cabin and is whispering and scraping at the screen door. But this, because he's the only one awake, is the only one to hear it, and he's freaking the fuck out. But she just goes away. The camp had to be sold due to lawsuits and whatnot, and the company owning this current camp bought the property. Well, they built the shrine to Mary and the church and all the cabins and had no problems, except where her house was, grass wouldn't grow. So they put a basketball court over it. But about a decade ago, the shrine had to be repaired because it was old. The lifeguards have to do safety drills where they dive down to the bottom of the lake to make sure no one is drowning. Well, during one of those, one of the lifeguards spotted a red eye and an arm and freaked out because he heard the stories. but they finished fixing the shrine and haven't had a problem since. There is probably a better way to tell this story, but I didn't hear it enough to remember every detail. Story 7. My favorite is probably the keyhole. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked and no one was allowed in there. Especially no one should look inside the room under any circumstances. So he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. The next night his curiosity would not leave him alone in the room with no number on the door. He walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was completely white. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. This disinclination saved his life. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole. This time, all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything out besides a distinct red color, unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before and had blocked the keyhole with something red. At this point, he decided to consult the woman at the front desk for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look through the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in that room and her ghost haunts it. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their red eyes." Story 8. In the town next to mine, we have an abandoned part of a railroad that supposedly is haunted by the hooker men. The tradition is that you take a group of friends to the abandoned tracks and tell them the story. The story goes that the hookerman was a railroad worker who had his arm cut off in a train accident 100 years ago. He was said to have worked on the very train tracks you are standing on. He was signaling an oncoming train to stop, but as the train approached, he tripped on spare railroad parts and was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, the train had cut off his arm. He now wears a hook, and the hookerman's ghost appears on the tracks carrying a lantern and looking for his arm. At this point, you and your friends are on the tracks, and of course it's pitch black out. The end of the tracks has a road going perpendicular to it. When cars drive past, you see a short, bright flash of light way down at the end of the tracks, but of course you can't hear the car, so it's more like a strange glow from far away, right over the abandoned tracks. My friend's dad took a couple of us down on Halloween night, and we were about 10-13, so it was pretty scary. Apparently, this is an urban legend in a lot of places, but this particular setup is in NJ. I just read about the legend in the town I'm talking about, and apparently due to the type of rock formations and the conductivity of the railroad tracks, it's metal. There's a phenomenon of glowing lights that actually happens, so maybe that's how the legend got started. Story 9. My grandfather was born and raised in Debrucenwye, next to the Willowamok River. He and his brothers and other local friends would go out to drink at the bars in Livingston Manor, and one of their favorite pastimes was fucking with the city idiots, who would come up from New York City, especially during deer hunting season. One year they made buddies with this one dude at the bar. This would have been sometime between 1920 and 1925. They all got drunk together. First, they convinced this guy the side hill googer was real. Legs on one side shorter than the other, evolved for living on steep terrain. They come in two types, left side hill googers and right side hill googers. As their target was about to leave for the evening, drunk as a skunk, they warned him about the creature that lurked in the night. It was a terrible creature that would only attack a man who was carrying an oil lantern from the dark side. So the only way to be safe was to keep the lantern moving by swinging it around in a circle over your head as you walk. That way there's no dark side from which to attack. And then they pissed themselves laughing as they watched the man stumbling his way home with the lantern swinging in circles as they followed his progress all the way up the mountain. He never stopped swinging it, all the way there. Story 10. Here is one that has been told at a camp that I used to work at. the story of Johnny No Face. So at this camp, there is an island owned by the YMCA, Satellite Island. It was once an old logging island. There is even a cool log jam where a few hundred old logs have created a dam. Nowadays it is used for camper overnight trips, where campers will stay on the island for a night and go walk around and explore. A while back trips would be 3 nights, today it's only 1 night. So as the story goes, during the mid-90s, a group of campers went out for their trip, and this group had a particular individual who liked to wander off and do his own thing. His name was Johnny. Now the thing about this island is that there are a lot of tall cliffs, and the trails run alongside the edge of the cliffs. On the first day, after the campers settled down and built camp, 2 of the counselors took a few of the boys, including Johnny, on a hike around the perimeter of the island. During the hike, Johnny wandered off from the group and no one could find him. They double-backed on the trail and tried to find him. No luck. As the sun is slowly setting and the counselors are cooking dinner, Johnny comes walking down from the trail. Johnny's counselors were relieved that they weren't going to have to radio back to camp to report a missing child. The counselors questioned Johnny to figure out his whereabouts, and he told them that he saw a different trail and wanted to check it out. The trail cut into the middle of the island. They spoke to Johnny for a while and explained to him why it was not okay to wander off from the group. So Johnny wasn't allowed to leave the campsite the next day. He had to stay back with whoever didn't go exploring and play card games and hang out around the campfire. The next day, Johnny begged to be allowed to go back and explore more of the island and show everyone else the other trail. The counselors reluctantly decided to let him go and let him lead. This way, they would know where he was. They all went and explored the main part of the inner island. While exploring the inner part of the island, Johnny disappeared again. Now this island is fairly large, but not huge. But it was big enough that if they couldn't find him before the sunset, they would not be able to search into the night without the risk of getting lost themselves. So, they went looking for him, but the sun did begin to set, and they had to make their way back to the main campsite, leaving Johnny again alone in the woods. The counselors knew the last time this happened, he returned on his own before dinner. They assumed this would happen again, but dinner came and went, and still no sign of Johnny. By now it was dark out, and any search would be futile. So they decided to wait until morning, and if he wasn't back, they would go back and look for him again. Well, when they woke up, Johnny was still missing. They took a group of boys and went on a search party. They walked back towards the inner island down the other trail that Johnny showed them. No luck. They walked around the perimeter of the island and still couldn't find him. As they walked along the trail near the cliff edge, they saw something being pushed up and down along the rock face of the cliff. They were too high up to confirm their fears and had to take a rowboat to the location when they returned to camp. As they row closer, they can slowly tell that it is indeed a body, but can't tell if it is Johnny or not. When they reach the body, they flip it face up, and all that is left of his face is torn up flesh and his eyes. The rest of his skin had been scraped off by the waves pushing his body against the rock face. They had to call the Coast Guard and come take the body. Rumor has it that every once in a while, if you're on the island at night, you can see eyes, just cold eyes staring at you from a distance. It's Johnny. He is watching you. A boy goes on a camping trip on an island, falls off a cliff at night, gets pushed back and forth against the rock face of the cliff, and has no face when they find him. He now haunts the island. Story 11:1. In the village where I lived, there is this belief that crossroads are haunted. About 10 years ago, some famous local punk was coming home drunk and claimed that he saw at a crossroad in the village a singing pig with sunglasses. That's right, a pig standing on his 2 back legs wearing some nice sunglasses, singing and gesturing towards the fellow. Don't know why, I always found the story hilarious, except when I am at that crossroad in the middle of the night. 2. In Slavic culture, there is this creature called Vadima. During the day, they are respectable women who can go to church without repercussions and have a more or less normal life. During the night, however, they transform into evil naked women, with untangled hair, roaming the streets and fields at night doing witchy stuff and fucking with people badly. They say that usually the local priest knows who is a Vadima, but is afraid to say so because they will kill him. They also say that firstborn people are safe from them. Anyway, this was just some background. When I was a child, some old man, I think it was my granddad but not sure, told me the following story. It was the middle of the night and I got out for a piss. In the countryside, there is no toilet inside the house, when I heard a noise coming from the street. As I looked out over the fence, I saw this young man, a bit drunk, walking on the street and singing. Following him, however, was a Vedima, an old Vedima, with wrinkly skin and evil red eyes. I wanted to shout, to warn the young man, but for some reason, I couldn't open my mouth. The young man was walking unaware of the situation when the Vedima approached him from behind and jumped on his back. She then took her 2 little fingers, stuck them in his mouth, and pulled the corners, like putting that metal thing inside of a horse's mouth. The young man was very scared and panicked and tried to get this evil thing out of his back, but he couldn't shake it off because Vedima is told to possess great strength. So he started running and tumbling with the Vedima riding on his back. I was still very scared, but somehow I found the strength to grab my axe. Slavic people are usually fond of their axes, and follow the Vedima and the young man. I was behind her, but I haven't had the courage to attack her, so all I could do was just follow them. It said that Vedima releases stra, a fear so that her victims are easier to fuck with. I think I read somewhere that there are sounds that cause fear. Anyway, the Vedima was riding this young man and I was behind them. The Vedima didn't ride the man at random, but had a very precise destination in mind, a local chasm at the end of the village, approx 30 meters high. I was playing around that chasm when I was a child. I was starting to figure out what the Vedima intentions were, but still I couldn't do anything but follow them out of the village and near the chasm. When it got near the edge of the chasm, the Vedima jumped off the back of the young man and watched him as he continued running, and eventually fell into the abyss. I watched the scene with my hand holding tight to the axe, frozen between fear and courage, just maybe 30 meters behind it. And suddenly, the Vedima turned her wild head toward me and stared me right in the eyes with those red evil eyes. I don't remember much after that except that I was running like hell and how I shouted the gate behind me. After some time passed and I recovered myself from the fear and exhaustion, I remembered that I had gone out to pee, and apparently I did pee, only not in the toilet. 3. While I was in high school, I used to live with my grandma and my uncle during the high school time. On vacations, I went back home. My uncle used to drink shitloads of alcohol, like kilos of the stuff every day. He was a good fellow, a sportsman, and a ladies' man back in his day. But then he got married and his wife left him and he started drinking. This has been going on for some years now. Anyway, I was coming back from school one day and I saw my grandma, a very religious woman, performing some religious incantations outside his door, like the ones you see in an Orthodox church, and praying and doing basically a form of exorcism. As I came closer to the door, I could hear my uncle inside talking to himself and some other entities. He was alone in the room, shouting to leave him alone, cursing, etc. Apparently, he was seeing demons. Fast forward a couple of days later. I am sitting in the room with my uncle, and we talk. I ask him if he saw demons and he tells me that he sees them right now, hanging to the icona, a sacred painting depicting saints at which people usually pray, sitting on the TV and laughing at him. I was like, if you say so. A week later, I was browsing the local library when I found this book about demons with all these really nasty pictures inside. Just drawings, but really evil-looking stuff. And in my naivety, I took the book and went to confront my uncle. He wasn't seeing them anymore or drinking. I told him about the book and I started showing him pictures of various demons. He was looking at it, somewhat uninterested, when suddenly he saw one picture of a hideous demon, and he said that one of those he saw looked just like the one in the picture, and begged me not to show the book to him again. I was a little freaked out by the whole story, so I thought to share it with you. True story.
The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.